here on a sunny Friday afternoon in the UK, and with me is Amy Downing, who is saddle fitter of Jeremy Rudge Saddlery. And I got to know Amy a couple of years ago when I suddenly got this phone call going, I've been reading your book, For the Good of the Horse, and your Saddlery chapter, and I'm really interested in what you've been saying. And I'm a saddle fitter, and we'd love to meet you and make you a saddle. And I went, ooh, that's an offer I can't refuse. So at that point, I met Amy and her partner Jeremy, and we started talking saddles, and we came up with a saddle for one of our school horses. And it all started, as you can see in this photograph, by putting a tree on the horse and fitting the tree to the horse. But I think we should maybe start by telling Amy and Jeremy's story. Although maybe I should say before that, what we hope you'll get from this is to be a more knowledgeable purchaser if you're going out to purchase a saddle, to have an idea of the changes that might happen in your horse through the seasons and the relevance that might have to your saddle, and different shapes and types of saddles. And basically what we hope you will be through looking at this is a much more informed consumer with an idea of the shape that you need from a saddle and what it is your horse needs from a saddle. But anyway, what I'm going to do here is see if I can get Amy to tell me her and Jeremy's story, which I think begins with when Jeremy left school and whenever he did.
Yes, back in the 70s. Anyway, first I must just say hello and thank Mary for inviting me along here today. So yes, Jeremy's story started a good few years ago, back in the late 70s, when he started as a saddlery apprentice, which was really a job of assembling a saddle. It was just given all the pieces of a saddle and putting it together to make a finished saddle. During his sort of start, worked for several different factories in Warsaw, which is our saddlery centre in England.
So it starts off with a 3-year apprenticeship, is that
Yes,
right? And I imagine that's the same, is it, that anybody going into the saddlery trade now starts with the 3-year apprenticeship?
It's very different now. So it was a proper government funded system back when Jeremy started, and there isn't that luxury really now. Students have to make their own way into the saddlery trade and try and find their own apprenticeships, and they can go to college. There are 2 different leather colleges really. They don't specialise in saddlery particularly. They do all sorts of leather craft, from harness and car interiors right through to saddlery as well. So it has changed quite a lot in the time that Jeremy started, when he was a young man.
So he did his apprenticeship and learnt about putting, as you say, these various pieces together to make a saddle.
Yep, definitely. A lot of the machining and different aspects of making them was done by different people. He was really just assembling pieces that were cut out by someone else, machined by someone else, and then actually put together by him.
And you yourself have a background in the saddlery industry, so you did a training too in your youth.
Yes, I started as a bridle maker. I'm really what's known as a bench saddler in this country, which means I did general repairs to all sorts of saddlery and harness, stitching by hand. I used to make special orders if anybody wanted anything particular, sort of special brow bands or nose bands, and the sort of more unusual things. And I slowly progressed through making sort of saddlery items into the saddle fitting as I got a little bit older and more experience.
All right, meanwhile, I've just canned the telephone. My friend did tell me I should have unplugged it, but I didn't do it. So you initially were a bridle maker and you were doing repairs and things like that, and from there you progressed into saddle fitting.
Yes, so that I was lucky enough. My first job was actually as a bench saddler in a tack shop, which sold saddles as well as doing the repairs and the special orders. And it just became more and more of what I did. Just starting, very small, did a few jobs, and just got bigger and bigger from there.
And then there was a point where you went to work in Sweden.
Yes, I did. I went overseas for 3 years, and that's when my saddlery or my saddle fitting part of my job really started to take off. That was what I did every day, 5 days a week for 3 years. So that was the biggest sort of change in my career.
And so it's when you were in Sweden that you met Jeremy.
I did, yes.
So I have to tell you that Jeremy and Amy are both business partners and amorous partners as well.
We are, yes.
Are you married?
We're not, no.
You're not, no, but they're a great team, I think, in all aspects of life. So you met Jeremy, and you were saying you were working for a guy in Sweden who was himself a very innovative thinker.
Definitely, always thought outside the box, always had a plan and an idea, always wanted to try and make things better and improve and just learn new things. And he was a great thinker.
And so Jeremy was supplying him with some saddles.
Yes, he'd been supplying them for about a year before I went over to work for them.
And so he was a regular visitor, and essentially it sounds from what you were saying earlier like you and this rather innovative Swedish guy and Jeremy ended up sitting down together and thinking well into the night and having long conversations about saddles.
Very much so, and certainly some of the ideas that we still use today came from those sort of days of thinking of how to make saddles suitable for different shapes of horses and make them work for different shapes of horses, but then still making them functionable for riders as well.
And basically, going back through time, through Jeremy's apprenticeship, that was not part of his training. So he, at this point, had his own saddlery business. He was making saddles both for the UK and for export to Sweden and the US and some other places too, probably. But sort of knowing about horses and how horses move and the interface between the rider and the horse in practical riding terms wasn't a part of his background.
Certainly not. Warsaw saddlers are taught to make saddles, and I know Jeremy went into it literally as a craft. He wanted to learn a skill, and he wanted to be able to make something and to work in an industry where you actually produce something at the end of it. So for him, it was purely a job that he wanted to do from the craft angle of it. It wasn't anything from a horse angle at all.
So those days in Sweden were the craft angle meets the horse angle.
Definitely, yes. And I think really made him think about what he'd been doing for all those years leading up to it, and actually what saddles have to go through in their working life. We make saddles, and we're lucky enough that we stand in a workshop and produce these things, but when they actually leave us, they have a very demanding life, and it helps to know what they're going to be put through when they're out doing their job.
So we've got this picture that we've started off with here of a saddle tree on a horse's back, and you start all of your commissions from the tree.
Yes, we believe that you need to start from the inside and work out. The tree is the only solid structure within a saddle. It is the basis that a saddle is made on. It's all the pieces are attached to it. It's what holds the form and the shape of a saddle. So it affects both the horse and the rider.
So it's kind of like if it's not right in the middle, it's not going to be right anywhere else, as it were.
No, it is the very bare bones of a saddle.
So anybody looking at this picture, what should they be looking at that kind of tells them that this fit is actually, or this saddle is a good fit on this horse?
What I'm looking for when I actually put a tree on a horse is as close a fit as possible to the horse. That you're not always going to find an absolutely perfect fit for every horse, but we're looking for a good fit all the way along. We can see that this actually follows the angle of the horse, and we have at the back here a very small gap, but it's not too big, so we would certainly look to see if there's another tree that is a better fit, but this would certainly be a good starting point for me. I'd be quite happy to see that on a horse as a finished saddle for somebody to ride in.
And this gives a bit of clearance at the wither here with this tree.
Yes, The other thing that you can also see from this picture is it looks quite balanced already. It doesn't look like it's riding up or down a hill. So if you imagine this as a finished saddle, all you're actually doing is lifting it off the horse's back with the panel, so it's softer and kinder against the horse's back.
And it looks, as I look at it, kind of in proportion with this horse. And in terms of, we've got the horse's spine in the middle here, and we've got the tree points coming down here. And we're looking for a situation where the tree points are not digging into the sides of the horse, right? If the tree was too narrow, that would be happening.
Yeah, so we're looking for a nice even contact through all of it, or as much as we can possibly manage. And I think you make the good point of saying that a saddle should look like it's part of a horse. It shouldn't look too big or too small. It should kind of look like it's meant to be there.
Yeah, and this looks like a good jigsaw kind of shape. Now, I was rather disappointed when Amy said to me that she thought the pictures of badly fitting trees didn't show up well. But we're about to change this to a picture of a badly fitting tree. And she went, oh, it doesn't look as bad as it is. It doesn't really show. And I went, well, I think it does show, actually. I mean, it doesn't look appropriate to this horse in the way the last one did.
To me, the big thing that you can see is where the stirrup bar ends. And it's very, very small to see, but you can actually see that it's sort of pushed the hair slightly. And what this actually means is that the angle of both the rail and the stirrup bar.
So the rail is here.
Yeah, that's the rail. And the angle of the rail and the stirrup bar correspond to each other. So where you can see the slight bit of pressure at the end of the stirrup bar means that the angle of the rail isn't particularly good on this horse.
Yes, and on the last picture we could see a fair amount of the horse's spine through here in a way we can't at this point. So the proportions of that look very different.
There's also a slightly bigger gap at the back as well, that it's actually
here.
That this tree is actually slightly flatter than this particular horse, so you can see that the gap is slightly bigger where the gusset would be in a finished saddle.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is show you two trees. So these trees are just placed beside each other on a rug so that we can see them. So maybe first you should just talk about the difference between this one that you can see is obviously wood and this one, which I think you're going to say is wood underneath this covering.
Yes, they're both made in the same way, using the same techniques and the same materials. The dark brown one just has a finishing covering put over it, and that's what you can see in the colour difference. But the actual process to make them is the same, and they are made of the same materials.
And these bits here, these are the springs in a spring tree.
Yes, and that's what you wouldn't have in a rigid tree, and most modern trees are actually spring trees.
Right, and a rigid tree would be wood in this entire shape.
Yes, so the whole back section would be a solid piece of wood, so it would be almost like a sort of paddle or a spoon sort of shape. It would be completely.
So the bit I'm running the mouse, the cursor around here would be solid wood in a rigid tree.
Yes.
So this has reduced the weight of the tree,
yes.
but kept enough strength and resilience in the tree.
Yeah, exactly. So you're taking quite a bit of wood out of the tree and replacing it with much lighter spring steel.
Okay, so the difference you can really see here would be the difference in this distance here in this tree. So this is the distance between the rails. We looked at the rails in the tree on the horse's back. And then this distance here between the rails on this tree.
Yes, and this is the part of the saddle that's usually referred to as the twist or the waist. And for us, it's about fitting a saddle, or a tree needs to be fitted to a horse, and we need to think 3D. We need to think front to back and left to right. So it isn't just a question of taking a wither tracing and fitting the width of the horse. It needs to be considered its whole back. And this is where it's very important to find the right tree for the right horse.
And I think this is where, looking at the two trees on the horse in the last two photographs, we saw one tree that gave plenty of space. The first one we looked at, and you could see the horse's spine here. And the second one was more this kind of shape.
Yes, so it lifts everything up off the horse's back, so you're not getting that nice even coverage and actually supporting the weight of the rider through a nice even weight bearing surface.
So do we want to talk about the width in the twist of the tree at this point for the rider and the horse, or do we want to go to our assessment photos and come back to that?
We could talk. We've got the photograph now. We could talk about it while we can see it all at the same time.
So what would be the pros and the cons of these two shapes for the rider and the horse?
I think for the horse, for me, it's always about fitting the horse into the correct tree for that particular horse. And this is where we often come into a little bit of conflict with riders and horses, that riders often find that the slightly narrower twist more comfortable, but it's not necessarily more comfortable for the horse. That's if you've got a very broad horse, you need a broad twist to actually sit around the shape of the horse's back.
So part of the difference here is the width, and part of the difference, I think, is the angle.
Yes, it's both together. You can see on the dark coloured tree that the distance between the rails is much greater, and the angle of the rail is a flatter angle as well, to accommodate. People talk about tabletop backs on horses. If you imagine that you have a withery thoroughbred compared to a cob, you can see the difference of the angle of the horse's back and the width of the horse's spine.
So if we're sitting in front of a table here, and if I put my hands on the table with the little finger edge of my hand on the table and the thumb on the top, I could move my hands to point in towards each other.
Yeah.
And I would be simulating the rails, and they could be at closer to horizontal or a more acute angle.
Yes.
Yes. And so my understanding is that a saddle could look pretty good from the outside, but if these rails were at a more acute angle that didn't really suit the horse, the bottom of the rails could dig into the horse. But
yes.
You wouldn't be aware of this when you bought the saddle.
No, so yes, you've got it exactly right there, that if you imagine your little finger is the bottom edge of the rails, and that's what's going to be carrying your weight as a rider on the horse rather than the full width of the rails.
So that's a deal, isn't it? Getting the rails the right angle, as it were, for the horse. And so your reckoning is that some riders will choose a saddle that would have the rails at a more acute angle because they're going, oh, I really like a narrow twist. And you're going, well, that doesn't actually suit the width of your horse's back.
No, and this is where it's very important to actually start from the inside out and put those trees on horses' backs to see what's suitable and what fits that particular horse.
All right, so maybe we should come now to our assessment photographs. So here we have 3 horses.
We've got 3 different types. We tried to find some different examples. We have a nice thoroughbred at the start. In the middle, we have a sort of a middleweight cob, and on the end we have a fairly heavyweight sort of traditional style cob.
I didn't mean to do that. Can I shift them right again? Come on, horses. All right, I've lost my thoroughbred and I can't quite get him back again. We can still see most of him, yes. So you've just basically started here with 3 different horse shapes.
Yes, so as we all know, horses come in different shapes and sizes, so it's not one size fits all. We have to, again, think of it 3D. We're looking for fits from head to tail and also left to right. And we can see.
Okay, so here we've got the same 3 horses, is that right?
Yeah, they're in the same order. So we've got our thoroughbred, and then we've got our sort of middleweight cob and our heavyweight cob on the end.
And we've got 3 different trees, and you're reckoning good trees for these horses.
Yes. So we can see again, we've got a nice even contact, that there aren't any gaps, that we're looking at a good weight bearing surface to start from to build a saddle around.
And this tree looks a different shape to the other 2, in that it curves away from the back more gradually.
Yes, there's two different sorts of tree. The first two are what are called two-piece trees. So there is the rails, which we were talking about earlier, and the cantle is actually put on as a separate piece. And then the one on the end is a one-piece tree. So all of the rails and the cantle is all the same piece of wood. It's actually all a one-piece construction.
And what will be the pros and cons of each one?
It's finding the right horse. That there isn't really a bad tree, it's just a bad fitting tree. As they fit the horse that they're on, but if we swapped them around, they wouldn't look as good as they do. If we took tree number 3 and put it on horse number 1, we wouldn't have such a good fit, and we would start to get a really big gap at the back as it lifts away from his back too soon.
And as I understand it, this tree in picture number 1, I think, is the tree that my saddle was built on.
Yes, it is.
And you were telling me a story about this particular kind of tree, that you were desperately searching for a tree. You had in your mind what you wanted. So
yes.
Tell us that story.
Yes, I sort of knew what I was looking for. We were looking for a very straight tree. It is a very flat tree for sort of more of the warm blood types. And we'd searched all over. We'd been to many different manufacturers in the town, and we were sort of getting to the point of not really being able to find what we were looking for. And Jeremy suddenly remembered he had 2 old hunting trees up on the roof of our office, and he went up and found them, and they were actually rigid trees covered in dust, been there since I don't know when, and they were exactly what we were looking for. That was the start of that tree that we now make many saddles on.
And it dates back originally, in the original rigid version, you reckon, to the 1930s or so?
Yes, we're sort of talking sort of wartime, when hunting was only really the sort of pleasure riding of its day. It was hunting saddles or nothing really back then.
So it's not always the new and the whizzy and the bells and whistles. No. Sometimes it's a back to basics kind of philosophy.
It is, yes. We all like to try and be modern and think of new things, but sometimes it's good to go back.
All right, now I'm thinking that what I'm going to find here is each of those horses with the final saddle on.
It is all in the same order again, with the tree of the pictures we've just seen and a finished saddle.
And yes, all of those saddles look like they sit rather comfortably on those horses.
I hope so. I still see 2 of them on a regular basis, so they're still riding in their saddles several years later.
So you were telling me earlier about some work you've done with an endurance rider.
Yes, very challenging, but very rewarding. It puts saddle making into a whole new level, I have to say.
And her story was?
Yes, I saw her first, it must be nearly 3 years ago, with a halflinger with some quite severe white hairs either side of the spine, and getting to a point where she couldn't actually compete any further. She couldn't take her ambition of competing for Great Britain any further. She got to sort of 50–60k and was struggling to get the horse fitter and staying sound past that point.
And so you made her a saddle.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, on that same tree, was that right?
It is, yes. It's back to the old style tree again.
And she's now
competing on the GB development squad, and she rides 160k.
So that would be one kind of improvement that you could make. I have to say, the saddle that these guys made for me, I like very much, and actually we could come up with a photo, couldn't we, of something rather similar.
We can.
So mine isn't quite as swish as this. It doesn't have quite so many, what do you call it, piping? What would you call it?
Welting is the technical term for it.
So mine doesn't have the welting. And then were you telling me that this isn't normal leather? What is this?
That's actually Italian calf, and the leather in the flaps and the skirts is what we call mellow, which is a pre-oiled leather, so it's very soft. It feels quite sort of broken in even when it's new.
So this saddle was made for a young pupil of mine who's out competing a lot and I think rather likes to be trendy. So mine doesn't quite have the piping, but I have to say I am incredibly comfortable in that saddle, and I think everybody that's ridden this horse has been very comfortable in it. And it gives the room that the rider needs to get from where she'd be sitting in the saddle about here, yeah, to have her thigh at an appropriate stirrup length. So our baseline is the idea that the rider's thigh bone should be around 45 degrees, which is halfway between horizontal and vertical. So that's making the thigh bone follow this kind of angle to the knee coming into that knee roll, to the lower leg coming back underneath here. And it seems to me that an awful lot of saddle makers think that the rider's thigh is going to be vertical. And any rider in a saddle where the flap is vertical, so if the flap is chopped off and coming straight down like this, it can be really difficult for the rider to get the stirrup length that actually works. And Amy and I had this discussion when we first met, where she said to me, well, I thought you might know why saddles are being made in these particular shapes and designs. And I said to her, well, I thought you were going to know why it was that these are the latest trendy shapes and designs. But when you look at top class riders, you will find top class international competitive Grand Prix dressage riders with the thigh at 45 or perhaps 40 degrees to vertical. And yet the average dressage saddle I see out there doesn't accommodate that.
Well, it certainly it can be done, and that was what we wanted to try and do with the saddle that we made for you, is that maybe we were bucking the trend and making something slightly different. And yes, if I'd like to know where the idea of the vertical came from.
Yes, so it's one of these things that nobody has any idea quite where trends start, but somewhere they start. But what is going to be true is that saddle companies are going to make what sells.
Yes, definitely.
And what sells may have many different shapes and forms. Another thing that I see a lot is riders seeming to want to be in a saddle that's very small and that curves up behind their butt and maybe has some mammoth great thigh blocks and fits them into a place and gives them no possibility to move.
I think that's certainly the fashion at the moment. I know we do make saddles with very big knee blocks and very deep seats, and often in quite small seat sizes as well.
Yeah, and you think those are for riders who want to feel, as it were, held in place by the saddle?
I think so, yes. I think that certainly is the fashion of the moment.
So given how versatile these guys are in their saddles, this is another one.
Yes, again, I mean, it fulfills the same philosophy. It's been fitted to the horse in exactly the same way, starting with the tree, and it's actually built on a conventional English tree like the ones we've been looking at. It just has a very different shaped flap, and it was just done to somebody's personal taste.
So I imagine this is somebody with an Iberian horse. Was it somebody with an Iberian? Yeah, so it's a rather baroque saddle for somebody who was an Iberian aficionado. I have to say it looks very beautiful with all of its stitching there. I'm not sure I'd want it, but I can admire it as a work of art. So this is a very different style. Tell us about this one.
Yeah, I mean, as we make very small numbers of saddles, we can make pretty much what people are looking for. And this one has what we call an external knee block. We try and do them so they're as bespoke as we can make them. We actually have demo saddles that have a big hole in them where the block goes, so we can actually position it for that particular rider.
And this is a trend that I keep wondering where this started. Do you know where this trend started?
I don't know. I think on many levels as saddle makers, we're probably the last to know. We just get asked to make things, and a lot of it, I think, is personal taste, and some of it is fashion.
Yes, and I have a sort of ambivalent relationship with these thigh blocks. Sometimes I think they make it hard for people to do rising trot, which is, you know, something I think everybody really needs to be good at, especially the average rider who's learning basics and learning to match the forces which the horse's movement exerts on their body. What they do give you is the possibility of pushing your thigh and your knee up against a resistance. And some of the time that can be very useful. But I think these can tempt people to do that all the time, which could be too much of a good thing. So I don't myself have a saddle in this shape, but I have colleagues that ride in them and really like them. And for me, the jury's out a little bit. So time will tell on that one, I think, if it is a saddlery model that kind of withstands the test of time.
Do you think it's a style that's better for different levels of riding? Do you think this is something where it's come from?
You know, I really don't know, but it does remind me of an Australian stock saddle. Have you been in Australia and seen some of those? It is the modern day dressage version of an Australian stock saddle.
Yes, it is. I have to say, I've never thought about that, but yes, it certainly is.
All right, we've got some more photos here, but so now we're into jumping saddles, I think.
Again, same principle for fitting. The main difference really with a jumping saddle and a dressage saddle is the stirrup bar. The jumping saddles have a slightly shorter stirrup bar just to help with the position of being really more up and out of the saddle rather than actually sitting in it like you do with a dressage saddle.
So if we go back to our first two pictures of the trees, the naked trees on the horse's back, and the second picture we looked at where the tree did not fit so well, and you could see the end of the stirrup bar digging into the horse slightly. On that saddle, if a saddle had been made on that tree for that horse, would that stirrup bar have been a pressure point potentially on that horse's back?
Yes, I think we still put with the wool panel, but it's not incredibly thick. A wool panel, when it's actually on, is probably only about an inch, maybe an inch and a half thick, and it is just wool flocking in a sort of a leather pocket. So if you've got something that's pushing an angle in towards the horse, then it is still there. There is a bit of padding around it, yes, but the angle is still pointing in towards the horse.
So recessed stirrup bars, which of course riders really like, because then the stirrup leather is not rubbing against their thigh and making them sore. So that gets the pressure out of the way of the rider. But a very recessed stirrup bar on a not very well fitting tree would put the pressure potentially into the horse.
Yes, it certainly can do. There are different sorts of recessed stirrup bars, and some of them fit very well and follow the line of the rails. So if the rail fits the horse, then the stirrup bar will as well. So it's really just finding the right combination for that particular horse.
Yes, and if the rail doesn't fit the horse, as we said earlier, then the chances are the stirrup bar wouldn't as well.
Yes, they usually follow the same line together. So if one's wrong, then the other one is most likely to be wrong as well.
So this picture shows that same saddle from the top, and here more than any other picture,
you need to give a little bit more time
you
between
can
changing
see
pictures.
the shape of the twist. Yeah, so this is the twist. Okay, sorry, I thought I'd counted enough there. So this is the twist, yes?
Yeah, this is what everybody refers to when they're saying about how wide the twist is. This is what you can actually feel when you're sitting in the saddle.
And I have a memory from many years ago of riding somebody's horse in a lesson and getting on that saddle and going, oh, this saddle just fits me. Just like, yes, I think I found the ultimate saddle. Of course, I rode on that saddle once. And one of my colleagues the other day was telling me about a saddle she'd just got that she sat on and went, this is the shape of my pelvis.
It is, and we are all very different, and the saddles are very different. As saddle manufacturers, there are many things we can do to improve the feel of saddles. So they can be webbed differently. There are different materials we can use on the seat to make them feel different, and also make the shape slightly different, so it fits the shape of your bottom when you're actually riding.
Okay, so we have yet another saddle here.
sort of a dressage Icelandic. It is a dressage flap, so as you can see, it's quite long and straight. But it was for an Icelandic horse, and it does have all the little D-rings for their little bags that they take with them when they're out riding.
Yes, so this would be not my favorite shape of flap. I would say that most saddle flaps, if they're cut a little bit more forward than this, give a room for the 45-degree thigh, which is going at this kind of angle. But this flap must have been what this rider wanted. It must have fitted her well. And we've got one more saddle picture here. Oh.
So this is actually part of the manufacturing process, just to show that we do actually cut things out by hand. When we say they're handmade, they quite genuinely are. There's very little of the process that's actually done by machine. We have sewing machines, and that's about as far as it goes on the technical front.
Yes, so this is a very craft, bespoke injury.
Very yes, right down to the very small parts. It's all done by hand.
So let's come to some of the myths in saddlery. What do you think are the biggest myths that need busting for somebody out there to make a really good decision when they're out shopping for a new saddle?
I think one of the biggest things that I often read in magazines and you see in sort of adverts is that the bottom half of the saddle is for the horse and the top half is for the rider. I think for me that's the tree is what shapes both the top and the bottom half, and it influences how it feels for both horse and rider. So it isn't just about saying, well, I'll buy a wide fit for my horse and I'll buy a 17-inch for my bottom. It has to be both things considered together.
So the bottom line, really, that wasn't meant to be a pun, but the bottom line has to be the shape of the horse.
Yes.
And so do you think that often requires compromises from the rider?
It does. I think that the tree is the biggest influence on how it feels for a rider, and the horse is the biggest influence on what tree will be used in that saddle.
So that might mean that the rider's riding on a wider twist than they might have chosen.
Yes, definitely.
Left to themselves. But if you're working with somebody on a saddle for their horse, you will start with the tree and really do a convincing job on the rider on this is what your horse needs and this is the shape your saddle needs to be.
Definitely. And as I said, there are things we can do with the seat to make it feel different. We can strain the webs differently, and we can use different materials to make it feel hopefully more familiar and more comfortable to the rider.
So what else are myths that you think are significant?
I think that one of the made-to-measure myths that people often say that they've had a wither tracing and they've bought a made-to-measure saddle. And I think for me, made-to-measure is, again, a more 3D process. It isn't just about one measurement, it is about many measurements and many sort of different angles need to be considered.
Yes, so a wither trace basically isn't it.
No, I think we were talking earlier that if you had anything else made to measure, if you were going to buy a pair of leather boots, for example, you don't have just one measurement of your foot or your leg taken. There's many measurements of both your foot and your leg to actually get what is a proper made to measure boot.
Yes, that's very true. So when you're measuring a horse's back, so what measurements do you take?
We still take the wither tracings, and we also take the 18th rib and what is known as a true drop, which is from the horse's wither down to the 18th rib. So we know sort of the difference between how high the wither is and how high the back is. And then we just try trees on. So we've actually put the trees on that we will be making the saddles out of.
So some of the myths that I think are out there is the whole idea of dressage riders having very long stirrups and a vertical thigh. I mean, that actually went out with the age of those woodcuts. Do you remember those old woodcuts you see sometimes where the rider has a pointy hat on and he's probably holding a stick up in the air and he's got great long spurs on? And we're going back to, I'm not quite sure what century, and he will have a vertical thigh.
Mm-hmm.
And modern riders, I mean, if you look at the top British riders, you look at Charlotte Dujardin, the length of her stirrups, her thigh is not vertical. The saddle absolutely needs to accommodate that 40 to 45 degree thigh. And I would say as well, give the rider a bit of space behind her butt and some room that she actually can maneuver a little bit.
So you're a fan of the flatter seats and the more open seats of...
I am personally, yes, because I think sometimes the rider needs to be a little bit further forward in the saddle and sometimes a little bit further back in the saddle. And that is the way that she is actually moving her center of gravity and maybe using that to influence how she adjusts the horse's center of gravity. And that a saddle that just holds the rider in place doesn't give her that option. So I think another point of mine too would be, you know, people are always saying the stirrup leather should hang vertically, and yes, on a well-made saddle the stirrup leather will hang vertically, but I see saddles every now and again where the shape of the tree and the way the stirrup bar has been riveted onto the tree means that the stirrup leather, if the rider is in a shoulder hip heel line, is not vertical, is actually behind vertical. So what would you say about that and stirrup bars and tree shapes?
There are many different options with stirrup bars. We've used E-bars and we've also used adjustable stirrup bars, which your saddle actually has. Yes. Adjustable stirrup bars. And it is, I think, a difficult compromise that stirrup bars come in two different sizes. There is the standard, which is put on GP and jumping saddles, and there is the dressage bar, which is put on dressage saddles. And they're the same size, whether it's a 16-inch saddle or an 18-inch saddle. So we can't always guarantee that that stirrup bar is going to be in the right place for that particular person. And that's one of the beauties of either the adjustable bars or the E-bars, that they can be placed in the right place for that rider.
So I just put this photo up here thinking we were going to see the stirrup bars on the trees, but actually we're not, because they're not on these trees, are they? So which one was the good one? That's the bad one. So hopefully by now you can see this first picture we started with of the tree on the horse's back and this stirrup bar that wasn't shuffling the hair or digging into his back at all. And that would be a dressage stirrup bar.
Yes, the standard show bars are an inch shorter. So that would mean that the line of where the stirrup would actually hang would be an inch further forward.
So it would end, they'd be sort of ending here and coming more here.
Yes.
And I see people sometimes where, you know, to get a shoulder hip heel line on a stirrup bar further forward than this, the stirrup leather has to hang behind vertical, which means the person is fighting gravity, which really doesn't help. So making sure that your saddle and the way the stirrup bar is fitted onto it allows that vertical stirrup leather with a shoulder hip heel line, I think that's an important piece. So you were talking earlier, Amy, about the idea of being able to get 3 fingers under the pommel, which certainly I grew up with, and I think everybody in Pony Club grows up with.
And I think it's still used today, and it is it's a very useful thing to bear in mind. But I think definitely just bear it in mind. It's certainly not a hard and fast rule that's set in stone. A lot of it depends, obviously, how big your fingers are, and it also depends on what sort of horse. If you've got a very round cob, you will probably get more than 3 fingers, and if you've got a very high width of thoroughbred, you will probably get less.
But if it was less than 1 finger, you might be worried.
Yes, definitely, and I think you certainly got to look at the bigger picture of what you're actually putting it on, and what discipline you're going to be doing. If you're a very small rider doing dressage, then you haven't necessarily got to have huge amounts of clearance. If you're a much heavier rider doing jumping, then yes, you do need more clearance. It's about looking at more than just the 3 fingers.
So what would be your tips for somebody who's saddle shopping?
Try and sit in as many saddles as you can possibly find. Beg, borrow and steal, really. I think just try and get as much experience of how different saddles feel, whether they feel good, bad, whether they give you the support you want. Just lots of different saddles, and just get as much choice and variation to look at and sit in as possible.
And you know, and you would say too that if the tree needs to be a certain shape to accommodate your horse, and when you first sit on the saddle you don't particularly like the shape of the twist, then get over it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it happens quite naturally. I think it's often very difficult when you get out of one saddle and into another and it's a very different saddle, and I think a lot of those feelings of it being uncomfortable are just because it's different. And I think we as humans can get used to an awful lot of things if you just give it a little bit of time.
Yes, so you sound a bit like me in riding lessons, saying to people it's going to feel bigger than it looks. You know, this is like when you lose a filling or you get an ulcer in your mouth and it feels huge, but it actually looks tiny. So you sit in a saddle of a different shape and your first thought is, oh, this is a hideous, huge change, but it actually doesn't take that long to become much more normal.
No, and I think this is why it's so very valuable to sit in a lot of different saddles as well, because it really it gives you a much greater understanding of what's available on the market, and how it feels, and the benefits to be had of finding a saddle that truly fits your horse.
So we were talking earlier about, you know, that there being a lot of saddles on the market that have been endorsed by a big name rider.
Mm-hmm.
And that, of course, those riders are going to be supremely talented. They may have their own sense of saddlery and what they need as an extremely talented rider. They may be somebody with a very different body shape for you. For instance, one possibility is that they're a guy and you're a woman. And we haven't gone into pelvis shapes here, but guys and women do have very different shaped pelvises and somewhat different likes, I think, because of that. And so the question would be, just because rider X thinks this is wonderful, does their body size, does their type, does their skill, does their recommendation translate to you as maybe a more average rider?
I think definitely that would certainly be a word of advice that I would say is don't go out and automatically buy something that someone else has got just because they've got it. Certainly look at it and find out about it and try it. But yes, I think you need to consider how you're going to be using your saddle. Do you do the same thing as this other person? Are you built like them? Is your riding ability the same as theirs? And they're all very valuable things to consider when you're actually looking at buying a new saddle.
Yes, and you were saying earlier you had the idea that it happened more in the US than here, and from my experiences of being in America, I can believe you're right, that there might be somebody who is the head trainer in a barn who likes a certain saddle,
Mm-hmm.
and then everybody in the barn ends up with the same saddle, but it may not fit their body type, their shape, their skills.
Yeah, and I think you could possibly spend a lot of time struggling with your riding because you've not found the right saddle for you. And I think it's certainly, yeah, just sit in lots of different ones, try lots of different ones, and just really know what you like. And it's not necessarily what somebody else likes.
And I think we have the situation here where I've said that I like a very simple saddle, you know, with a fairly flat seat and enough room to maneuver. And you've also made a saddle for my colleague Denise O'Reilly, and she likes it slightly differently, I think.
Yes, she has the same cut of flap as you, so she's still got the 45-degree. But she likes a deeper seat. She does like a deeper cantle rather than the flatter open type that you've got.
So before we open this up for questions, what would be your last sort of reckoning on the do's and don'ts of saddle buying?
Don't rush into it. And I think I would always say, yes, don't rush into it. And I suppose the old advice that your mother always said about count to 10 and actually think what it is that you truly want and truly need.
And of course, somebody buying a saddle out there in the market is not going to know very much about the tree that saddle was built on.
No, and it is a very difficult thing. Even of the years I've been working with saddles, if I see a saddle that's not one of ours, I can't guarantee what's in there without actually taking the saddle apart to see what the tree is like. But I think as a somebody who's buying a saddle, ask the questions. If you can find out what's in there, then you can certainly be more aware of whether it will or will not fit your horse.
Yes, and of course the biggest don't is probably don't just buy a saddle out of a catalogue because it's brown and 17-inch and medium fit and you like the look of it.
Yes, I mean, it's always tempting. We're all drawn by pretty saddles and ones that are nice colours, but there's, yes, a lot more to consider than just whether it's the right colour or not.
All right, so Peter, I wonder if at this point in time we should open things up for questions here, and whether you have any questions from folks out there.
Hi there, Mary. So I do have one question from Pascal. I've been told that a close contact saddle can be very close to the withers, i.e. one finger is okay. Is this true?
I think I would always say it's about checking that the angle of the head is correct. If the saddle fits correctly and the angle is right over the wither, so the support is right, then yes, it can be okay. But it would certainly need, I would say you need a professional to make sure that it does actually fit properly and it isn't just too low.
And I mean, I would say too that sometimes I will climb up on a block beside a rider to bring myself higher off the ground so I can put my hands on their body. And sometimes at that moment, I look at the saddle and the pommel and I will pop a finger or two under the pommel. And when you go back an inch or two, so I guess at this point, I'm saying when you get back to that point on the tree, suddenly I realize it's pretty low there, even though it might not have felt so low there.
Yes, and that is very common, and that's, I suppose, the point I was actually trying to make of making sure that the points of the tree are fitting. If the angle and the fit is correct over the wither, then it should be clear further back, like you were saying. It's making sure it is actually the right fit. It's just a close contact, not that it's just too wide and sits too low.
So do you want to say any more about horses losing and gaining weight and monitoring the fit of your saddle on an ongoing basis, or the best way to kind of deal with this as time goes on?
It is horses are always changing, and they change throughout their life, and I often advise my customers to weight tape their horses. I mean, if you've got a weight tape, that's great, or you can just do it with a piece of string if you want to be very low tech. But just to keep an eye on their weight, and you do it in the same way as you were weight taping. And if they lose or gain about an inch, it's roughly a width fitting.
Oh, that's interesting. So an inch difference in the whole round the back, round the tummy on a weight tape.
Yeah, is about a width fitting.
Wow.
And one of the things that's very helpful, if you do it sort of once a month, once sort of every 6 weeks, so you get a rough idea of how much your horse fluctuates through the year. But I would always say, always try and do it at the same time of day. So if your horse is in at night, then always do it in the morning, or always do it in the evening. So you're not measuring the fact that they've just been outside all day and eaten lots of grass. So yes, certainly try and sort of maintain a sort of a system to it if you do it. And it is very useful just to know the parameters of how much your horse loses and gains through a year.
And in an ideal world, how often do you think each rider would have a saddler, a saddle fitter like yourself, come and look at their saddle and their horse?
I'd like people to do it at least twice a year. And that really should take in sort of a spring and autumn. So you're talking a horse that's sort of possibly rested slightly over the winter and then is slightly sort of fatter than usual on spring grass, and then also at the end of the season to make sure that they're going to be okay just to go through the winter and tick over, really. That's if they're competing horses, or if they're happy hacks that their work level may not be consistent through the year, and it does affect their weight and their shape.
Now, all the saddles that you make have wool panels.
Yes.
Yes, and I've watched you adding flocking to a wool panel and watched you take the saddle apart to do that. How often would you expect that a wool saddle would need the flocking to be looked at?
When it's new, it usually needs it more often. I would say that it certainly needs checking really within the first 3 months of being brand new. It does all settle, and the leather settles, and it molds to the horse. I often find that people start riding a lot more as well when they've got a new saddle, so the horse changes shape as well. So certainly within the first 3 months. Again, it does depend on how much you use the saddle. If you're riding every day, then it will compress quicker than somebody who rides 3 or 4 times a week. But the sort of the average expected lifespan of the flocking after it's been adjusted is about 2 years.
Right. Yeah, so I wonder how many people really do have their saddle reflocked every 2 years.
Probably not everybody.
Yeah, I rather suspect. And there could be people like you running the length and depth of the country if people were that smart, and that concerned and really taking seriously those changes.
Yeah, and I think it's not just as much of the horse changes that we're dealing with natural fibres. It's a wool panel, and it's in a leather pocket, so it's all natural fibre. It's all prone to compression, and it's also susceptible to the humidity and the atmosphere that it's kept in. So it's not just a changing horse; it's also a changing saddle as well.
So, Peter, have we got any other questions for our last couple of minutes here?
Nothing at the moment, Mary.
Okay, so I think at this point I get to say a big thank you to Amy for coming and spending this time with me, and for giving people, I hope, some really great ideas about what to look out for and the pitfalls and the myths around saddlery. So a big thank you to you.
And a big thank you to you too.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.